Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Cabaret Voltaire, Shadow of Fear. Wow, now here's a band I was not expecting to be able to talk about like this. Cabaret Voltaire were a band from Sheffield who were among the progenitors of industrial music, and one of the most influential names in all of electronic music as a whole. Originally consisting of Chris Watson on magnetic tapes and electronics, Stephen Mallender on lead vocals and bass and keyboards, and Richard H. Kirk on pretty much everything else as well as electronics and keyboards himself. Though Chris Watson broke off after the first couple of albums, most of these are just Mallender and Kirk. But yeah, these guys' career arc had gone on for decades and have had several different phases to it. Starting out in super experimental Dadaist territory, then moving into some new wave type stuff in the 80s, and finally ending up in straightforward ambient techno by the 90s. I'd first gotten into them years ago when I was first starting out college. Like a little while before starting up this channel at all, since they'd been marked as a favorite band of many of my own favorite bands, most notably Orbital. And they ended up becoming a favorite of mine as well. Despite not being much into industrial music myself, they'd remained my one familiar entry point into that genre for a long time, and I've obviously referenced them many times on this channel over the years. I definitely consider myself enough of a fan of theirs to be willing to do a proper series on them someday, and that would definitely be a pretty meaty series. But their last album was in 1994. They've been broken up since. Sure, Richard Kirk had been staying pretty active under his own name, and a shit ton of different aliases, but I figured the Cabaret Voltaire story was over at this point. Still, now that I have the chance to go back through their catalog and reevaluate how I feel on these guys, having not listened to much of their stuff outside of 2X45 or The Conversation since those early college years, I just went back through all those old albums, and here's my thoughts on their discography so far. Just core studio albums, no live albums or soundtracks or compilations or that kind of thing. Trust me, this segment is gonna be plenty overlong as it is. So here's their debut album from 1979. They had been around for a while before that doing shows in underground circles, but they signed to Rough Trade Records and got to put this out, and we're of course starting in the most freaky and out there experimental territory. Buzzing and wailing electronics, noisy guitars, semi-talking, semi-singing vocals, sometimes not even any melody or tune. Just hyper-abrasive and frightening stuff that is absolutely not for the faint of heart. But yeah, surprisingly I thought it was pretty cool for what it was. Hardly one of my big favorites of theirs. I need to be in a very specific mood to most get into it. But I can definitely appreciate the creativity on display here, and it isn't unmusical or anything either. There's just enough groove and texture here for me to still be able to connect to it, and there is some appeal to how dingy and low quality everything sounds. Probably not a good starting point for these guys, but it's not bad. And this is basically a better produced and more interesting version of the last album. Lots of abrasive psychedelic drones and tape manipulations going over drum machine beats, with Mallender's occasional yelling on top. Again, very out there, not for the faint of heart, probably even more frightening and out there and intentionally unpleasant thanks to the better production and focus. The last one could sometimes feel like a bunch of edgy kids trying to piss off the neighbors, where this is creating something more portentous and weighty. You can really hear how the industrial scene was able to grow out of projects like this. But yeah, definitely worth a shot if that's what you're into. Bit long-winded in points, but I didn't mind this either. Okay, this mixes post-punk with more creepy electronic experimentalism, and ends up with their most focused and well-realized project up to this point, inspired by the rise of religious fundamentalism both in the Middle East and the West with right-wing evangelists. Also markedly easier to get into than the last two, which isn't saying much, but you know, while being no less freaky and strange. All that weirdness feels like it has a more defined direction than the last two. This is widely considered to be their big, most important classic, and while this is also a project that I respect more than I enjoy or feel compelled to put on very often, I only like it and don't love it, and like the last one, it can be a bit long-winded in points. But, it's still probably essential listening, and I definitely enjoyed it for what it was, so yeah, it is good stuff. But if I'm in the mood for some earlier cabs, I'm a lot more likely to go towards this, the last album with Chris Watson's contributions, and my favorite project in this first phase of their career by a long shot. Arguably more of a rock album than electronic, but it absolutely kicks ass. It's like avant-garde industrial funk music. A lot of the same kinds of abrasive and freaky sounds that you heard on their previous albums. Malender's typically demonic shouting vocals and ominous vocal samples like the ever-iconic "The 70 billion people of Earth, where are they hiding?" But the core grooves underneath all these tracks are freaking unstoppable, and in spite of these tracks often running on longer than the ones on their previous albums, I never get bored of any of them. If you've never heard a Cabaret Voltaire album before, this would probably be the one I'd most recommend starting with. Love the shit out of this one. Alright, Chris Watson officially gone from the band, we've entered into the Cab's middle period in which their sound shifted over into more mainstream 80s new wave synth-pop type stuff. Though mind you, this is hardly a sellout move. Malender's vocals are still really menacing and intense. The melodies are often really dissonant and creepy, and there's lots of other strange experimental textures in the mix. The kind of stuff that can almost make Depeche Mode seem heartwarming by comparison. Even if those guys no doubt took direct inspiration from this stuff themselves later on. But yeah, this project holds up even better than I remembered. Tons of tracks that mix experimentalism with catchiness really effectively. Great album. Really should put it on more often. This is basically a similar mix to the last album, but more actually mainstream friendly and overtly musical. Malender's vocals picked up a lot more of that iconic whispery tone that I most associate with him. The closer, Sensoria, became a minor hit on MTV, and they became cool enough at this point that apparently in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off you can see a poster of this album in the titular character's bedroom. Still prefer Crackdown a little over this one, but it's a rock solid project in its own right. Also not a bad starting point for beginners. I guess this one's a mix of their last two albums, but more abrasive, blown out, and sample-centric. It's fun, but nothing new for them, and not one of their more memorable ones either. Though if this is the least notable album they put out, that's probably a good sign. One more album in their 80s synth-pop period, this one the most straightforward and pop-friendly of all of them. I will say this one took a while to really get going for me. The first few tracks felt like retreading familiar territory that blended into everything else they were doing in this era of their career. Though once we get to Here to Go, everything starts to develop a more lighthearted and even sort of funky flair that I found pretty refreshing. Still probably not one of my biggest favorites of theirs, but definitely solid stuff all the same. But speaking of lighthearted and poppy, this one really doubled down on that particular aspect of the last album, and we ended up with what's basically a straight 90s Chicago house album. Even recorded here in Chicago and co-produced by Trax Records veteran and Chicago house pioneer Marshall Jefferson. A lot of people will tell you this is the Cab's worst album, perhaps because it's so unthreatening and commercial sounding. A project which is in fact groovy and laid back, but not remotely nasty. But this was one of my biggest favorites of theirs when I was first getting into them in college, and yeah, I don't care, it still totally holds up. It's just some really freaking solid deep house music with charmingly dated and textured instrumentals and great hooks. Even Malender's more straightforward Phil Collins-y vocal approach didn't bother me. I get why this album is hated, but I do not think it's remotely deserving of that reputation. Anyway, now we've transitioned into the third and final phase of the Cabaret Voltaire story, the Techno Era. This is the last album of theirs that would have Malender's vocals on it, the remaining three would all be instrumental. You can see some of the house-influenced sound design from their last project also showing up on this one, but the overall approach is a lot more abstract, more meandering, and of course much less commercial or pop-friendly. Still ostensibly a dance album, like a fairly stripped-back, bleep techno sort of project. Lots of sharp 808s calling attention to their synthetic quality. And it's actually not a big favorite of mine. It's a bit overlong and not the most interesting stuff they do in this vein, but it's still pretty solid, and nice for the novelty of hearing Malender's voice over these kinds of instrumentals. And now for the last three, which Malender is credited for co-writing on, but many suspect are just Richard Kirk solo projects. Whether or not that's actually true, fact remains these are some of my favorite Cabs albums overall. They really were able to nail this ambient techno sound and pull off some of the best stuff I've heard in this style. And I have heard a lot of stuff in this style. This particular one still consistently retains most of the smooth and melodic deep house elements of something like Groovy, Laid Back, and Nasty, but presents it in a more abstract way with the only vocals coming from spoken samples, and it's way better executed than Body and Soul. It just creates this really nice, chill, but sort of futuristic atmosphere that I most enjoy out of this genre. Also, that reprisal of the 70 billion people of Earth, where are they hiding snippet on Soulline, fanservice-y as it is, still gets me hyped every time. This is unfortunately the only one of the later phase projects that's available on Spotify. The other ones are on iTunes at least, but yeah. In this final trilogy of Cabs albums, it is admittedly probably my least favorite, but not by much. is still really damn good. Bit more acid-ish, bit heavier on the samples, a bit creepier maybe. Less deep house too, but certainly not abandoning that sound either. And finally, we get to this final double album, which, yeah, I've highlighted it before when I did that Greatest of All Time list addendum and some other one-off mentions, but this is still my personal favorite Cabaret Voltaire project overall. The most cerebral and subtle of this final trilogy, but the most deeply atmospheric as well, and the sheer size and density of the project along with the lack of filler material make it a fittingly climactic send-off to this band. Which finally brings us to here. Yeah, glad to have my enthusiasm in this band fully rekindled and for the reminders of how many great projects they've put out over the years. Now, it's been 26 years since the conversation, and Cabaret Voltaire is now handled by Richard Kirk alone, which honestly didn't bother me since I kind of forgot that Melander even contributed to the last 3 projects at all. But yeah, back in 2014, Kirk revived the Cabaret Voltaire name as a solo alias to do some live shows. And now we have a brand new comeback album, which is also the only one to be handled by him alone. I had no idea what to expect from this. I wasn't going out of my mind with anticipation, admittedly, since, 26-year gaps between albums don't tend to lead to great music. And with their legacy so well secured on top of how satisfying a send-off the conversation was, adding another project could theoretically end up really embarrassing and unnecessary. But I just jumped in anyways, so what did we get with Shadow of Fear? Well, it was actually really damn solid. I think this is about as good as I think I would reasonably want a new Cabaret Voltaire album in 2020 to be. Certainly could have gone way worse than this. This album does have a feel to it that isn't quite like any of the other Cabs albums, but still feels like it's deserving to be called a Cabaret Voltaire album, and fits well into the image and vision that the band had when they were still together. It kind of feels like an attempt to bridge some of the styles of their final ambient techno phase and their early more experimental phase. Or maybe more like their 2X45 Crackdown era. Like an attempt to bring their career full circle or something. At its core, Shadow of Fear is a techno album, like those last 3, with plenty of old school acid flares to boot. But it's nowhere near as pleasant or welcoming as the 90s trilogy. None of these smooth, deep house elements here. These sounds are a lot more overtly menacing and aggressive. There's quite a bit of harsh, distorted textures all over the place. It's got way more of an edge to it. And yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. It's really tight and to the point, well constructed, unique sounding. Each of the 8 tracks has its own identity and fits into the mix cohesively. I'd be lying if I said I found it completely mind-blowing or anything, but it sure was a lot better than I expected it to be. So okay, may as well go through individual tracks. Opener Be Free does a good job of setting the tone and letting you know what you're getting into. Lots of clanking and clattering house-adjacent drum machine beats, wobbling and wavering bass synths, distorted screams, various vocal sample interjections about cities crumbling, and even a horn section. Probably synth horns, but they do actually kind of sound like real ones, I don't know. It's psychedelic and menacing and has a lot of really solid build-up, sounds great, sounds like Cabaret Voltaire. And a lot of these tracks in the first half similarly have a lot of menacing build-up and dark atmosphere like that. Probably the strongest example of that is The Power of Their Knowledge, which combines humming synth pads with periodic blasts of acid synths and super sharp drum machines that are much more overtly synthetic than the openers. Not to mention some skittering and nervous melodic textures and possibly some guitars. And, of course, the ever-ominous pitch-down voice sample saying the title. Really freaking cool sounding stuff. Now, not every track is a winner. The track Night of the Jackal felt like some fairly generic and cliched sounding electro in its mix of 808 beats and honking bass lines. Still definitely a solid groove for what it is, but I do think the other tracks on here captured some more unique and effective mixes, and I feel like I've heard this kind of drum pattern dozens of times over the years. Microscopic Flesh Fragment fared better. Its repetitive stop-start acoustic drum samples going against regular drum machines created a pretty creative polyrhythmic beat and went over its mixes of dramatic airy synth pads pretty well. Though I do kind of feel like that one showed all its best ideas in the first 2 minutes or so and wasn't among the most attention-grabbing moments on here. Still good though, and it was one of my favorites on first listen, even if others overtook it. But anyway, first half of this project is good, but the second half of this project is where things really get kicked into high gear. The drum machines on Papa 90 Delta United are a lot more fast-paced and fuzzier than any of the previous tracks, driving most of the mix on their own until about the 2-minute mark when all these super intense bass stabs come in and really give everything a sense of epicness and dramatic stakes. almost bordering on drum and bass, albeit with that kind of retro experimental flair that you would expect out of the Cabs. That one kicks ass. But my favorite track on here has to be the nearly 11-minute Universal Energy, which just drives itself outward into the cosmos with subtle bass washes, airy whistling pads, the usual chopped up vocal samples, and several thumping synth bass lines going over this intensely grooving, hi-hat heavy disco beat. It's kind of like a peak Darren Emerson era underworld groove if it were made in like 1981 or something. I had so much fun with this one. This one was great. Meanwhile, Vasto is yet another massive banger with a particularly raw industrial edge. The synths are a lot sharper and harsher on this one. The beats are even heavier than any other tracks on here. Ton of tension and energy going into this one, and it also totally kicks ass. And then finally, the closer, What's Going On, mirrors the opener pretty effectively and has a very similar mix of brooding synths and confused yelling samples, and even like some spy guitars in there, I think. And the maybe synth horn section coming back in a big way. Though I think this track pulled off those horns even better than the opener did. Like, they're a lot more present in the mix and do most of the heavy lifting instead of being mostly background textures as they were on the opener. And they're a freaking awesome touch. Fittingly climactic and badass way to close out a badass album. But yeah, that's Shadow of Fear. Pretty rock solid album. I hesitate to call this project properly great. A lot of these tracks just kind of stick to the same groove throughout their entire running time, don't have a ton of progression. Not as well suited to, you know, like sitting up and paying close attention. And in general, I feel like this is a project best for when I'm in a specific mood. But I had no expectations of this one being anything special, and I'm certainly glad it was as well executed and interesting as it was. This could have so easily been a bland nostalgia trip that rehashes old territory, or an average Richard Kirk solo project that had none of the ethos of what Cabaret Voltaire was all about. But I really do appreciate the creativity and the effort to make something that does embody the ethos of this band, but doesn't rotely copy previous work. This doesn't feel like a cynical cash grab, it feels like a proper addition to the Cabaret Voltaire canon, even without Malender's presence. And I had a lot more fun with it than I thought I was going to, so yeah, I will definitely take it. Definitely worth a shot for any longtime Cabs fans. This was really solid. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.